Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Collin Cleary, who has a professional background as a professor of philosophy. He also writes for Countercurrents and is largely aligned in terms of some elements, some mainly political elements of worldview, but is someone who has a deep background in the history of Western philosophy, is informed about Platonism, but I believe identifies more as a Heideggerian or neo-Heideggerian, which I don't share. So I'd like to become more familiar with Colin's perspective, and maybe we can get into some philosophical topics, including theology as well. Is it correct you identify as asatru?
Yes, I do.
Right. So I'm a Christian Platonist, but I'm very open to other forms of worship of higher beings. I am a monotheist kind of at the end of the day, but I believe there's a reality to the gods. So
hmm
maybe we can talk about theology and things like that. But to start, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and let everyone know where they can find your stuff?
Well, I'm Collin Cleary, and I have been writing for many years under different pen names. Collin Cleary is not my real name. I do have an academic background and have published a lot under my real name. And I began publishing under the name Collin Cleary in, I think it was 2002, when I co founded a journal called Tier with two friends of mine, Michael Moynihan and Josh Buckley. And that is a journal that's proven really popular in the sort of neo pagan scene. And it's published irregularly. I think we're coming up on issue 6. It takes a long time to put these things together, and I don't work on the editing any longer. I co edited the first issue. But that was when my work as Collin Cleary was first published. And what it was focused upon and still is focused upon to a great extent today is, if you will, the theology of neo-paganism and what it means to believe in the gods. I have a couple of central questions that I want to answer and that I don't have answers to, not exactly, not yet, but that I'm working on. And these questions have sort of animated my thinking and my writing for more than 20 years now. And the first question is, what does it mean to believe in the gods? Because I think we make a lot of assumptions about what the gods are and what it would mean to believe in them and how our ancestors believed in them. But I'm not at all certain that I know that. I'm not at all certain that I know what it meant for my ancestors, my Northern European ancestors, to believe in Thor, to believe in Odin, and the sense in which they worship these gods. And the other question, and we can talk more about that whole issue. The other question that I've been preoccupied with for a long time is, if we can figure out what it means to believe in the gods, is it possible to return to worship, to worshiping them? Is it possible to do that? Can we modern people do that? Can we return to that, for lack of a better word, belief system? Um, a lot of Asatru, and this is not just my opinion, it's the opinion of a lot of people, including people who have no interest in Asatru and no sympathy for it. A lot of Asatru, to be honest, is LARPing. It's people putting on funny Viking costumes and hailing Thor and hailing Odin, and sort of acting out the way that they think that their ancestors behaved and the way that they think their ancestors practiced their religion. So, to me, one very large question is whether it's even possible at this point in time for us to revive that tradition, because it's not a continuous tradition. Of course, it died when Northern Europe converted to Christianity. There were remnants of it that were preserved, but they're pretty much gone now. So those traditions died out. Is it possible for us to revive them?
Hmm.
So, in trying to answer these questions, I mean, I've been sort of all over the place. For the last several years, I've been doing this series on that's called Heidegger's History of Metaphysics, and my thinking did take a Heideggerian turn. But all of that is both an end in itself to explore the history of metaphysics from that Heideggerian point of view, but also because I think that exploring the history of metaphysics may be a vehicle or a way toward trying to recover what the mentality was of our ancient ancestors before the creation of the metaphysical tradition, and to try and understand what were the perhaps the root assumptions that led to the worship of the pagan pantheons and the what we could call, just broadly speaking, the pagan worldview.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I've heard this notion that pre axial age religion operated on very different assumptions. You even get it in Plato, it seems like, where he points to in the Cratylus the fact that the originators of the Greek language seem to prioritize process and flux, and everything originates from different types of movement compared to the axial age metaphysics, which, like Plato, postulates an eternal realm of structuring principles that then the mundane world is subservient to. The axial age um, revolution seems like a reasonable supposition. Do you think there's really strong evidence that there is a hard break, or is this simply a different mode of expression? Like, prior to philosophy, say, as a genre of literature, originated perhaps in the Upanishads in the Punjab, were they really getting at the same metaphysical concepts, but without this kind of direct dialectical process?
Well, that's a really good question, and I'm going to limit myself for the moment to the Western context. And what you've asked actually allows me to say something about why I'm interested in Heidegger. Because I mentioned that I've been working on this series that for a while I was calling Heidegger's History of Metaphysics. And the way that Heidegger views the history of metaphysics is that there comes a turning point in Greek philosophical thought with the pre Socratics, where there is, in effect, a denial of mystery and of process. So that what Heidegger believes is the earliest Greek thinkers, and he believes this was typical of pre philosophical thinkers, and perhaps typical also of Greek religion. Those earliest thinkers affirmed mystery, they affirmed absence, they affirmed process or the flux, which, as you know, Greek philosophers believed that that process, that becoming, that motion was fundamentally unknowable. So, what Heidegger believes is the earliest thinkers shared that view, but they affirmed that this was reality or an aspect to reality, the unknown, the mysterious. Heidegger talks about physis, which is the Greek word from which we get physics and the physical, and it's normally translated nature. And Heidegger argues that nature, which is a Latin term, is sort of a mistranslation because if you look at the meaning of physis, if you look at it etymologically, the connotation of it is a flux. He calls it an emerging, abiding sway, that being comes out of hiddenness or comes out of absence and presents itself to human beings and then goes back into absence, goes back into hiddenness. And that recognizing that there is this continual back and forth between presence and absence is fundamental to living in this world. And so, what he charges is that with certain of the pre Socratics, and very much so with Plato, what happens is a kind of denial of absence or mystery comes into play, where the Greek thinkers insist that what is truly real must be knowable. So the archetypal example of this, of course, is Plato and the forms. So the forms are what is truth, they are what is being, they are what is knowable. And by contrast, the world around us, the natural world, is a world of flux and becoming, and is unknowable as such, and does not have true being. So, what Heidegger takes that to be is a denial of the fundamental mystery that was affirmed by earlier thinkers and by the Greek mythological tradition, and putting in its place a kind of insistence that what is must be what is knowable to the rational mind. So there is this equation that comes to be between what truly is and what the human mind can grasp. And in effect, what's being rejected here is all those aspects of reality that the human mind finds mysterious and unknowable. And Heidegger has this grand argument where he goes through the entire history of philosophy up to the present, and argues that this view that I'm just describing is, for example, the ancestor to this scientism that we see around us everywhere today. The idea that what is truly real is what science can know. And if science can't understand something or can't account for something, then effectively it doesn't exist. So the idea is that the metaphysical tradition, and he tries to argue how this mindset that I'm describing, how it plays out from Plato to Aristotle into medieval philosophy into modern philosophy. There's a subjective transformation of it with Descartes and with modern philosophy, and up to Nietzsche, where it becomes radicalized. But what it all comes down to is this insistence that what truly is must be something graspable by human beings. And he wants to argue that there is this marked contrast here between what he takes to be the pre-metaphysical Greek view, which affirmed the fact that there is much to reality that transcends the human capacity to know and to understand. So that's kind of a
Mhm.
simplification of the
Yeah.
position, but it addresses the issue that you brought up about, if we are going to say that there's some sort of mentality that's pre-metaphysical that's been lost, what is that?
Mhm. It's a good characterization of the position. I'm still really not sure that it is anthropologically correct, at least pertaining to the Axial Age authors, especially Plato, because I think a lot of it is pinned on Plato, and Plato is blamed for this later scientism. But Plato was a mystic. Plato didn't believe that
Mhm.
everything was intelligible. He believed that we have an obligation to understand everything that we can at the level of dianoia, scientifically, rationally, mathematically. At the level of nous, he had his process for preparing ourselves to make contact with the nature of the forms and intuit the structuring principles that aren't procedural or deducible strictly, like he describes in, I think, the second letter. And then beyond that, he doesn't claim that this kind of intellectual intuition is the summit of human accomplishment beyond intellectual grasping of the forms. There's also entheastic states, inspired states, like he talks about in the Phaedrus. And people will say that he's anti myth, even though he's a great mythologist himself, constantly writing myths. But he's anti like poetry because he would censor the poets in his ideal republic. But then in the Phaedrus, he says that the standards for a genuinely inspired poet should simply be much, much higher. So he's not against
Mhm.
poetry. He's sort of a stickler for only that genuinely God sent kind of inspired message. And Proclus, who is extremely rationalist in some ways, makes it pretty clear that what we receive from inspired states, from inspired scriptures and myths and legends, like this is a higher form of knowledge. And I think that's valid in like a Jungian sense. What we receive from myth, these are symbols in the Jungian sense, meaning they're forms that are present to the unconscious that the conscious mind has not fully realized. Like the conscious mind is this thin surface, and the unconscious, which contains those structuring principles, actually, for Jung, the obviously archetypes of the collective subconscious, it presents like half pieced together intimations of the nature of this realm that the conscious mind just cannot fathom, cannot grasp. So in the
Right.
same sense that Jung accepts mystery, accepts mysticism, the Neoplatonists absolutely did. I mean, you can't read a book like Problems and Solutions Concerning First Principles by Damascus and walk away thinking that these were Cartesian rationalists. Now,
Right.
later in the history of Western philosophy, I agree that this, I don't know, like SAS Percipi kind of
Hmm.
mentality goes too far and there's a
Hmm.
reductionalism about it. It's
Hmm.
probably best exemplified in actually a guy I'm a kind of a fan of, Max Tegmark, the contemporary physicist from Sweden, where he believes that things are simply mathematical at heart, because his argument is that our best possible description available of physical processes boils down to basic quanta, basic ratios, so mathematical entities. And beyond those mathematical entities, we don't have any better way of capturing the nature of the physical world. And so he kind of bites the bullet and says, well, then, what we're actually looking at is a mathematical structure. He views the physical
Hmm.
world as simply one species among many of possible mathematical structures.
Right.
Um,
Well, so
yeah.
so there's a lot there. But now I'm going to surprise you by saying that I agree with everything you've just said. So
Okay.
I agree with your account of Plato, and I think Heidegger would too. Um, but you have to make a distinction, and this is crucial to understanding what Heidegger's doing and what I'm trying to do using Heidegger. You have to make a distinction between Plato and Platonism. Now, the way that you've just described Plato, as a student of the dialogues myself, I agree with that completely. The Plato that I like is the mystical Plato, and I think that's the real Plato. I think that there is some question whether Plato really did believe the forms were knowable, or we could say, did he believe the forms were knowable in some discursive sense, or was it rather in some kind of mystical sense? So the problem is that Plato, and we could also get into the whole Straussian interpretation of Plato, according to which, um, a lot of the dialogues, they have an esoteric dimension, and Socrates doesn't say what he really means. Like the Republic, for example, the Straussian reading of the Republic is that it's not a serious political proposal. What it is a reductio ad absurdum against the idea that you could build a perfect society. So there's the real Plato, and I think you've done a very good job of describing who the real Plato was, and I agree with that. But then there's what the tradition took Plato to mean. And I don't think that what the tradition took Plato to mean, in other words, quote unquote, Platonism, was the real Plato. But the trouble here is that the real Plato, that we know and love, was not what influenced subsequent generations of philosophers. It was this construal, this construct called Platonism, and it's Platonism that Heidegger is really attacking. The trouble with that is that's what was influential, and that's what shaped the tradition after Plato, was this particular reading of what Plato was saying, that he was denying mystery, that he was
Mhm.
insisting that what is has to be fully knowable.
I
So,
guess I don't really know who that would be, who would be a Platonist in that sense, because I think most of the Neoplatonists fully embrace that mystery.
mhm. Well, this is a general tradition of Plato and a way of interpreting Platonism, including more complex forms of Platonism like Neoplatonism. But I think we see right away in Aristotle this kind of Platonism, because in De Anima, when Aristotle talks about knowledge and he talks about nous, there is this idea that the nous, the human intellect, has no nature of its own, that it is in a way nothing, and has to be nothing so that it can absorb the intelligible forms, which is the human process of knowing the world, is taking in these intelligible forms that we find in the things around us. And those come to be on our nous. And nous, in order to receive those forms without any kind of obscuration, has to in itself be nothing. But the assumption there is that those forms can come to be completely within nous and are fully knowable, therefore, by the human being. You see? Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Isn't that, though, just Aristotelianism? This is the criticism of Aristotle that even the later Neoplatonists who were trying to harmonize the two would levy against him, that he reduces like the Platonic theological hierarchy, which goes up to a first principle, which is ineffable. It can only be indirectly pointed to, and even the highest of the forms, these are seen as inherently ineffable, super intelligible, meaning beyond intellectual grasp. It takes a higher faculty that we don't possess to understand the real roots of the nature of being. But then for Aristotle, he cuts it off. Well, according to someone like Simplicius, basically at the level of the demiurge, right? The
Mhm.
demiurge has all these paradigms in his mind, according to Plato and the Timaeus, which actually he's looking to a prior paradigm, probably, which the Neoplatonist Proclus will identify with Phanes or Cronus. Alternatively, Proclean theology is really interesting and rationalistic, but also kind of goes beyond the limits of reason. But in any case, he identifies, Simplicius does, Aristotle's unmoved mover as thought thinking itself with the demiurge,
Mhm.
which so I would blame that on Aristotle effectively and say that the Peripatetics are guilty of that. And then eventually the Neoplatonists assimilate the Peripatetic school. It dies entirely. And I think probably because in late antiquity, they kind of recognized as the commentary tradition picked up that this kind of reduction of metaphysics to simply the intelligible wasn't actually able to encompass a full religious life. And they were at that point in competition with the Christians. And so they
Mhm.
had to kind of remember that older form of mystical theology.
Well, I mean, I could say a
Sure.
couple things in response to that. The first is it is important in terms of understanding the Aristotle Plato relationship. It is important to bear in mind that Aristotle regarded himself as a Platonist. He did not regard himself as an Aristotelian. We use that term, right? So there is a place in Aristotle's writings, I forget where it is, I cannot remember where it is, where he uses the phrase we Platonists in addressing his students. And of course, it's very easy to see how, as Plato's student, what he's doing is taking up elements of the Platonic philosophy and transforming those elements, so that we have forms for Aristotle, but unlike Plato, he identifies the form of something with its function. And the way people sort of gloss this superficially is to say Aristotle puts forms in the things themselves, right? So supposedly what he's done is to eliminate the Platonic charismos, the separation between forms and sensibles. But then, of course, he just reintroduces the charismos by postulating the existence of the unmoved mover, who is
Yeah.
this
Or the active
transcendent,
intellect.
yeah, who is this transcendent being who transcends sensible reality, and which everything in sensible reality is striving to imitate. right? So
Hmm.
I think what we have. I'll also say this: if you read what Aristotle says about Plato, well, let me rephrase that. Everybody who reads what Aristotle actually has to say about Plato, I think, is disappointed. Because if you come to Aristotle's comments about Plato from really studying Plato and trying to understand what he's actually saying, the things that Aristotle says are, when he characterizes Plato's philosophy, are awfully literal minded, and it sort of makes you wonder how good a student of Plato he really was. You
Or
know,
how good faith he was being in those remarks. Like he can't be
uh,
that dense.
well, yeah, and that's a reason why you can't fully trust what he says about the pre-Socratics, because he always had his own axe to grind, like most philosophers. But my point is, the larger point I'm making is simply that I think that that Aristotle may have understood Plato's position on the forms to be this idea that they are in principle fully knowable by the rational intellect. And the other thing that I would point out to you, just in trying to understand this kind of reading of the history of philosophy, is think for a moment about what Kant, how he viewed Plato. So if you go and you look at the Critique of Pure Reason, there is a discussion of Plato, a very brief discussion, where he's trying to talk about the sort of philosophy that he rejects. Because, of course, as the title implies, he's critiquing pure reason. And so he's critiquing the idealism that thinks that we can use the intellect to fully and truly know being. And what he says about Plato in the Critique of Pure Reason to any student of Plato seems awfully superficial, but that's the reading. And that's the reading of Plato. And that's the reading that persists throughout the whole Western tradition. Although, yes, you are correct that the Neoplatonists, there's a much more nuanced reading of Plato that has been neglected. I mean, I can tell you, from having studied in a graduate program in philosophy and then taught at multiple universities, the the Neoplatonists are largely ignored. They're usually not a part of the curriculum. I took one class that was on Plotinus, but that was kind of a rarity. And good old Heidegger has almost nothing to say about the Neoplatonists. So, I mean, I think you're right that with the Neoplatonists, if we go back to them, we find a much more profound and nuanced understanding of Plato that isn't just the bad old Platonism that the tradition sets up as a straw man. But that straw man works through the whole history of philosophy so that people are either embracing Platonism in that sense, or they're reacting against it, like Nietzsche at the end of the history of metaphysics, saying that his philosophy is inverted Platonism. And
Hmm.
and and, and all he's understanding Platonism to be is just this idea that the ideas exist in another realm, and that's the true realm, and that knowledge of those ideas is true knowledge, and that the sensible world is non-being.
Right. Okay. Who is most guilty of this then? When I think in early modern philosophy, for example, of the most outspoken Platonists, yeah, I mean, Leibniz basically comes to mind. That's chiefly what Kant is responding to. But even
Mhm.
Leibniz actually prioritizes in a way like ignorance or what is not clear in his ontology, because every monad contains every other monad, right? And yet what distinguishes them is the degree of clarity that these different aspects of our experience have for us. So like his whole cosmos couldn't exist without human ignorance. It's kind of built on the nature of our ignorance. um, and I think he's a pretty thoroughgoing Platonist and
Mhm.
embraces the mystery. Maybe he goes a little bit too far towards rationalism in some respects, but I'm a big fan of Leibniz. I don't see anything really that he's doing that takes away from the mystery of God or the gods. And I think he was kind of just working within the theological confines of his day, and he stretches much like Hegel tries to do later. He stretches Christian theology as far as it can possibly go towards a more, perennialist or polytheistic worldview, but obviously can't quite get there.
Well, so I can address that the point about Leibniz, but I think what I should do first is sort of go back to the beginning and explain what Heidegger thinks is at the root of this, what he takes to be this reduction in the metaphysical tradition of being to what is knowable to human beings, okay, which is what he accuses Platonism of doing, and every subsequent metaphysician, including Leibniz, including Hegel, including Nietzsche. So, and I should add, by the way, that I'm not I'm not a doctrinaire Heideggerian. I'm not a follower of any philosopher. I'm interested in practically every philosopher for what I can get from them, from what I can learn from them. And I think that some of Heidegger's ideas are very valuable tools. So, so this idea that there's a turning at a certain point in early Greek philosophy, where thinkers begin to identify what truly is with what presents itself to the human intellect, okay, and therefore denying the reality of anything that is beyond the human intellect's capacity to know. What is at the root of that for Heidegger is, and this may seem like an obvious point, is a kind of an anthropomorphism. It's a kind of an anthropomorphism and a kind of a will. And Heidegger makes a lot of hay about what Nietzsche says about the spirit of revenge. And much of Heidegger's history of being, the whole project of it is really inspired by Nietzsche's approach to the history of philosophy. And you probably know that Nietzsche looked at Socrates and other figures in the history of metaphysics and thought that their philosophies were motivated by a revenge on life. So Nietzsche's understanding of Socrates, and Socrates for Nietzsche is the main villain. Nietzsche's understanding of Socrates was that Socrates, for whatever reason, because he had a snub nose or whatever, hated existence or hated life, and so chose to say no to life and to erect instead a fantasy about another realm, a realm of true being, which of course is only knowable to the philosopher. Now that's not my view, and it's not Heidegger's view exactly, but it's Nietzsche's view. So you can understand it sort of like as the revenge of the nerds. So the nerds secretly would like to be like the jocks, who have strong bodies and get the girls, right, and are very efficacious in life, and they succeed and they have drive. The nerds aren't like that. So what the nerds do is, since they can't succeed in that world in which the jocks succeed, is they decide to deny that world and to erect instead another world inaccessible to the jocks that happens to be the true world. And it's a world, of course, that only they can know, that only they, as the nerd philosophers, are equipped to know. So that's a kind of a caricature, obviously, of what Nietzsche's position is, but that's what he means by saying that metaphysics, including Platonic metaphysics, is motivated by a spirit of revenge. And Heidegger's position is not exactly the same, but it's very much influenced by that Nietzschean position. Heidegger thinks that behind metaphysics, and paradigmatically behind the metaphysics of quote unquote Platonism, is a kind of a human will to total knowledge and mastery. And the flip side of that human will towards total knowledge and mastery, which he takes to be just endemic in human nature, the flip side of it is a disgust with whatever is unknowable, mysterious, or cannot be grasped or cannot be mastered by the human intellect. And so, what Heidegger understands the metaphysical tradition to do beginning with some of the pre-Socratics like Parmenides, but getting into full gear with Plato, is that it in effect, through this willful approach, accommodates being to what human beings have access to what the human mind has access to. And so what Heidegger then does is he has, Heidegger primarily was a teacher, and most of the books we have by Heidegger, and there's a ton of them, just a huge amount. Most of the books by Heidegger are transcripts of lecture courses that Heidegger gave. And so what he proceeded to do after being in time was to lecture on the entire history of philosophy, and to argue that we see this kind of hidden will playing itself out throughout the entire history of philosophy, that if you just look more closely at each of the philosophers, you can see how, in some way, their philosophy is motivated by the desire to absolutize what is knowable and manipulable by human beings, and to denigrate and deny aspects of reality that are not. And really to deny that is reality. So what does he do with Leibniz? Okay, well, Heidegger, first of all, locates Leibniz within the Cartesian tradition. And in the Cartesian tradition, there is this epistemological standpoint called representationalism. All of the modern philosophers, up to Kant, are basically representationalists in one fashion or another. And Kant can be read that way, because sometimes he speaks misleadingly like he's a representationalist, but it's really not accurate to see him that way. But Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, Berkeley, Hume, Locke, in one fashion or another, they all buy into the assumptions of representationalism. And representationalism, is this idea that and I'm going to describe this in a very Heideggerian way. It's this idea that our consciousness is in a kind of a box. It's in a kind of an interior. And we don't have direct access to what's outside of our interior, to what's outside of the box. So, in front of me, I have a laptop, I have a bottle of water. For representationalism, I don't have direct consciousness of these things. Instead, I'm always locked inside my box. I'm locked inside my interior. And what happens is my mind takes in impressions and creates a representation. And they call this by various terms. Sometimes it's called an idea, not using the term idea at all, like the Platonic tradition does. And it's that idea, that representation, that I know directly. So I have sort of like an internal perceiver that perceives these ideas. And that's what I know directly. But I'm cut off from access to the exterior world, the external world, except by means of these representations of it. Okay. So what Heidegger says is at the root of this representationalist theory, first of all, and this should be an obvious point, is this divide between an in here and an out there. And this idea that I live in an interior, and that there's such a thing as an external world that is quote unquote outside me. Now that way of looking at things has been so much of a part of the history of philosophy, especially in the modern period. It's even taken up by the sciences, by cognitive science. We're so used to thinking that way that we never think to challenge that. This idea that I'm in an inside, I'm in here, and there's a divide between the in here and the out there. Now, Heidegger argues that what representationalism does is it puts the mind into this mindset that the out there is something that's set over against us to be grasped, to be possessed in some fashion or another. It's an other to me that must, in a sense, be overcome. So he sees in this representationalist idea a kind of adversarialism, a kind of idea that the mind is appetitive and wants to grasp what is out there as if it's like a quarry, as if it's like prey, and we're hunters hunting the prey, trying to get at the out there and to possess it. And he makes this argument, by analyzing the way that philosophers in the modern period talk about consciousness. And what he argues about Leibniz is that there's a certain point in Leibniz's writings, there's more than one place, where he identifies perception with appetite. And there are a lot of places where he makes this identification, which he makes explicitly. But in the very theory of the monads that you were talking about before, Leibniz argues that there is no external world. There only are ideas. And the reason why, for example, if I got up out of this room and I walked in the hallway, the reason why the picture changes and why I move from one to another, why consciousness makes this transition, is desire or appetite. So that the intellect has this desire or appetite that is endemic to it, and that perception itself is appetitive. And that what we are essentially trying to do, and that essentially perception is acquisitive. And it is driven by a kind of a will, which again you could refer to as appetite or acquisitiveness. So this is that same will that Heidegger sees as underlying the very earliest philosophy in Platonism, the bad Platonism, that will to achieve total knowledge and mastery of otherness. So he argues that what's going on with Leibniz is something that's an absolute prime example of that, because in Leibniz, a world beyond our interior has been abolished entirely. And all that exists are simply my ideas and the ideas of other subjects, the ideas of other monads. So if you go back to the beginning, Heidegger's arguing that no one in the ancient world is making a claim like this. They're not saying that in some way being should be accommodated to subjectivity, but that's nevertheless de facto what they're doing. This becomes explicit in the modern period. Heidegger argues with thinkers like Leibniz, who are basically making subjectivity absolute and denying the reality of anything beyond subjectivity. So that's his take. That's his
Yeah.
take on Leibniz.
Hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't call Leibniz a representationalist, but I do see what you mean of absolutizing subjectivity. And he understands the divine monad as transcending our comprehension. But it's what I was trying to point to before is that our ignorance or our obscurity is baked into the ontology of mind. So it's not like mystery is abrogated by the absolutizing of subjectivity. Instead, that mystery accounts for the nature of mind. It's constitutive of mind.
Right.
So I'm more sympathetic with Leibniz, and it also seems like you can't win whichever way you go. So whether you get rid of representationalism by having analyticity of predication and a total containment in one great field of all of being that we kind of reciprocally participate in, or whether you are a representationalist and there is this exterior and interior. Either way, it's like dominated. I don't like the psychologizing actually, where it's a bad will, it's an appetite, it's something like that. And curiously, like that seems to me, Heidegger is assuming really the axial age attitude of the renunciation of the will in doing that. So anyway, just some What
Well,
do you think of that psychologizing aspect? Do you embrace that? It also seems sort of like a just so story. It's like a narrative we can apply across thousands of years of intellectual history, and there's some, psychological mechanism he can point to. But I guess it's a hermeneutic of suspicion, I guess, in a way that
yeah.
I wouldn't
Well,
necessarily embrace.
well, let me make 2 points about Leibniz and what I said. So I wasn't saying that Leibniz is a representationalist. What I was saying is that the representationalist paradigm is really dominant in modern philosophy. And they're all in some way either buying into that or reacting against it or developing it in some fashion. So, I mean, to take a simpler example, to take a philosopher that's much easier to understand than Leibniz, but who nevertheless is a bit like Leibniz, look at Berkeley. Now, Berkeley begins with representationalism, with a kind of Lockean representationalism, where there's again an in here and an out there division. And what I'm aware of directly is just ideas, not exterior objects, right? But Berkeley then says, but if that's the case, how can I know that there is anything independently of my mind? So, starting from these representationalist assumptions that I exist, that my consciousness exists in an interior that is directly aware of ideas, he then simply severs the connection between the interior and the exterior, abolishes the exterior, and says that all that exists is the interior and the ideas. You say, so Leibniz is not a representationalist, strictly speaking, because that would require him to believe in the existence of things beyond the ideas that the ideas are representing. What
Right.
Leibniz shares with representationalism is this starting point of believing in an interior, okay, in an interior in which we're aware of ideas directly. Now, as to what you said about in criticism of Heidegger's history as sort of like a just so story, um, I think first of all we should characterize what Heidegger is doing just in very general terms. It's a philosophical history of philosophy. And the very first person to do a philosophical history of philosophy was Hegel. So early in Hegel's career, he gave his lectures on the history of philosophy, which are translated. They're in three big volumes, and he starts with the pre-Socratics and goes up to Schelling. And what he's attempting to do is to see some kind of an order to the history of philosophy, and to see some kind of telos to it. So that normally when you read histories of philosophy, like you read, Frederick Copleston or W.T. Jones, they're just going from philosopher to philosopher, not necessarily trying to tell a larger story and not linking the philosophers really beyond just talking about who influenced who. But for Hegel, there is an intrinsic reason or logic that is immanent in the history of philosophy and that's playing itself out over the course of history of philosophy, and that which reaches a climax with him. And that is his position. He doesn't come right out and say that because it would seem terribly arrogant. He doesn't say philosophy reaches its consummation with me, but that's the very clear and obvious implication of his position. So there's a telos, there's a hidden logic, a hidden direction to the history of philosophy. Now, what Heidegger is doing is something that's very much like that, except the conclusions he's arriving at are completely different from Hegel's. So, what Heidegger sees is there is an internal logic to the history of metaphysics where, in essence, what's happening is reality is being reduced to subjectivity. I mean that's kind of a way to put it in a nutshell. Is he sees there's a kind of a will there, but working behind the scenes, and the will is to reduce what exists, what is, to human subjectivity. Now, you're describing that as a psychological interpretation. And I think, yeah, I think that's correct because he is attributing a kind of a subconscious motivation to philosophers. Um, One of the differences, however, between Heidegger and Nietzsche is that Nietzsche is the one who, as I was talking about earlier, says there's a spirit of revenge going on in the history of philosophy. So Socrates is the sort of person who, you know, really, he got sand kicked in his face at the beach. And so he wanted to deny this world and create a world that only people like him are aware of or have access to. And that was a revenge on life. Heidegger doesn't really take that position. Heidegger's position is that the story is actually much more mysterious. So one of the ideas that Heidegger has that's very interesting and strange is he has this idea of what he calls epochs of being. That we go through different historical periods, and in those historical periods, being is understood in radically different ways. So that, to take an example that he himself uses, he understands the medieval period, the Christian medieval period, as one in which to be meant to be an artifact of an omnipotent creator. What is what's been created by God. By contrast, he argues that the modern period, the period of modern technological civilization that we're living in right now, is a period in which we believe that what is raw material for human exploitation. So that instead of looking at this plant that I have in a corner across the room and thinking, this is a creation of God, I instead look at this plant and think, what can I make out of this? Maybe I can make some paper out of the leaves of this plant or something like that. So in the medieval period and in the modern period, the period that we're currently in, there is this huge contrast between how being is understood, what we understand being to be. And Heidegger wants to guard against the idea that most people have, that change or those changes in how we look at being are brought about by human decisions. Heidegger argues that it's much more mysterious than that. He says that really, when we look at how we experience the world and how we experience history and changes of this kind, we don't really see ourselves as in control of these changes. They can't, excuse me, they can't really be attributed to the actions or the decisions of particular people or particular thinkers. Heidegger does not believe that philosophers move the world and that it's from the views of philosophers that our own outlook is shaped. Instead, he thinks that what philosophers are primarily doing is giving voice to the spirit of the times. So that a thinker like Descartes or a thinker like Kant or like Nietzsche, to take a real contrast, is giving voice to the spirit of the times, and in effect functioning as a kind of herald or a prophet. So that when Heidegger looks at this process that he sees at work in the history of metaphysics, where he thinks that what's going on is philosophers are trying to reduce being to subjectivity, he doesn't see behind that this sort of spirit of revenge that Nietzsche talks about. He thinks it's not entirely clear why this took over metaphysical thought in the West, that we're not able really to explain exactly what the mechanism is for why this took place. But he gives this complex argument moving through the entire history of philosophy from the pre-Socratics to Nietzsche, where he argues that this process, again, of reducing being to subjectivity plays itself out through that history and becomes progressively more and more radical. So to take the example that we were just discussing of Leibniz, you were arguing that there's still room for mystery in Leibniz, in spite of the fact that what exists are only ideas in monads. There is not a complete reduction to subjectivity, because there is still something that transcends my own individual awareness in my monad. There are aspects to reality that I do not know. And Heidegger wouldn't quarrel with you about that. He would simply say that in Leibniz, we have not yet reached the fully radical expression of this turn toward the subjective, of trying to reduce being to subjectivity. That comes with Nietzsche. And that is why Heidegger describes Nietzsche as the completion or the consummation of Western metaphysics. Because what happens with Nietzsche is that you finally arrive at a thinker who just basically says everything is subjective. Everything is open to manipulation by human will and human decision. We simply decide what the values are. There are no objective truths. There is no objective reality. All there is will to power and our own expression of will to power in creating the subjective perspectives in terms of which we live. So, what he's arguing is that there is this historical process that takes place that begins with pre Socratic philosophy and becomes progressively more and more radical until basically we arrive at this position that Heidegger thinks we're in today. He thinks we're living in the era of Nietzsche, where basically objective reality, any kind of being that transcends our subjectivity, has been in principle rejected. And in defense of that position, and you called it a just so story, and there are a lot of people that criticize Heidegger's history of metaphysics sort of along those lines. In defense of it, I would say that it has great explanatory power. And when Heidegger gets to Nietzsche, and that's what I'm preparing to write about at the moment, I'm going to write a series of essays on Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche for countercurrents. When you get to his account of Nietzsche, it's incredibly impressive because he ties up all of the threads of the history of philosophy and argues very, very convincingly that there are these tendencies that are latent in the whole history of ideas in the West that come to consummation and come to radicalization in Nietzsche. So, if somebody says, I don't buy this, or I think it's kind of like a just so story, the proof is sort of in the pudding. If you study what he says, if you go through the history of philosophy and look at it in the way he looks at it, I think if I'm not entirely convinced by it, I think it is very persuasive, and it does shed a great deal of light on what's going on in the history of metaphysics.
Hmm. The other sort of objection that comes to mind is, isn't that the point of philosophy? Isn't philosophy by definition this will to bring reality into subjectivity? To have knowledge of the world is to make it measurable and subjective and rational to some extent. And like, I'm sympathetic to some idealist arguments along those lines. For that matter, I'm sympathetic to Max Tegmark's argument about the nature of the physical world. I just think it's a little bit more subtle than Tegmark, where for
Hmm.
him the rational, knowable structuring principles are the reality. And I would say with Plato that the physical reality, physis, is a combination of the structuring principles, and also, like Leibniz believed, ignorance is actually built into what matter is. It is intrinsically the unknowable. And so the interplay of the knowable and the unknowable gives rise to behavior. And yet, even then, everything that we can know about, and we kind of see that in quantum dynamics. And Heidegger was a Platonist who kind of saw these parallels, or sorry, not Heidegger, Heisenberg, I should say.
Hmm.
Heisenberg was a Platonist who saw these parallels, and what we have access to, what we can measure, what we can interact with, actually makes a difference in the behavior of physical systems. So I think that's the subtlety that, I mean, it's not like Tegmark doesn't understand that principle in quantum mechanics, but I've never seen him spend a lot of time on the problem of observation or measurement. Um, so, what about the nature of philosophy as such, as the project to expand
Hmm.
human wisdom and knowledge? Doesn't it
Hmm.
necessitate that we bring as much into the subjective domain as possible?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think there's a key difference between subjectivity trying to understand the world and subjectivity trying to reduce the world to subjectivity. So you used the language of bringing things into subjectivity. Well, I mean, that's correct that we're doing that depending upon how you construe that. So what we're trying to do is to gain knowledge of the world around us, right? That surely is the aim of philosophy and also the aim of science. But what Heidegger is doing is talking about how the metaphysical tradition ultimately wants to understand reality as being subjectivity. Now that is not subjectivity knowing the objective or knowing the world. That's subjectivity trying to understand the world in a narrow sense as just being the same thing as subjectivity. Now, there's different ways in which, and again, there's different ways in which this plays out in the history of metaphysics. So sometimes there'll be a thinker who's a phenomenalist who actually does argue that the only thing that exists are the ideas in our minds. Like Berkeley is usually understood as saying. But this anthropomorphism, this making subjectivity metaphysically central, exhibits itself in much more subtle ways. So, for example, in Hegel's philosophy, Hegel understands the entire universe as having as its telos becoming knowable by human beings. In other words, human beings are the self-knowledge of the universe. We are ourselves natural beings, obviously. We have bodies. We're biological beings who've come to be at a certain point in time. But what our own nature consists in is to know that nature. So we are the animals that are self aware. We are the animals that attempt to know the world around us, that attempt to know the universe around us. And so for Hegel, what is going on in philosophy and secondarily in science is that reality is achieving consciousness of itself. And that's the telos of reality. That's its ultimate end for Hegel, to achieve self consciousness through human knowers. Now, that's not the same thing as a phenomenalism like you have in somebody like Berkeley or A.J. Ayer, where they're saying reality exists in the mind. It exists in this interior that I live in. Now, Hegel's not saying that at all. For Hegel, there are things out there. There's a natural world out there independent of my mind. But the point of the natural world for Hegel, the telos, is to give rise to my mind. So that what makes the entire world intelligible for Hegel is human spirit. It's the human mind. And so that's the sense in Hegel, uh, that's the manner in Hegel through which subjectivity becomes central, through which our understanding of reality gets thoroughly anthropomorphized. Because the whole point there is to say we're it. We're the point of everything. You see? So
Hmm.
so
Well,
and that's obviously not what we mean by understanding the world. I mean, philosophy trying to understand the world is not the same thing as reducing the world to philosophy or reducing the world to human subjectivity.
I maybe, yeah. I mean, going, I guess, a step further in defending the attitude that Heidegger seems critical of or he problematizes. Um, I like Chris Langen's argument around his principle of syndiphionesis, where if we exist in a medium in which we can interact with something else, it has to have something in common with us. We share a common syntax of operation. And so, like, radical differences in kind kind of terminate out as you engage in what he would call syntophionic regress. Like, what am I grounded in? Is it the real? Every other real thing has to ultimately, at bottom, have the same ground as me. And that is kind of the axial age insight, or at least where it originated, I believe, geographically, historically, in the Punjab. The Brahman is Atman kind of concept, which you could also see as a kind of absolutizing of subjectivity, or
Absolutely,
turning
yeah.
the world into one big subject. Um, but I'm also sympathetic to it, because what's the alternative? Do we have no common ground at all? If we have no common ground, like, say, just using the Hindu language, in their view, everything has this common core in
Mhm.
Brahman, which isn't being in like the Greek sense of ousia. It's something deeper and more mysterious, and isn't a subject. It only becomes a subject in the tantric language when the Purusha aspect of Brahman projects through his active will the Prakriti aspect. Or, you might say in Platonic language, it's only when the limiting factor of the monad reigns in the unlimited factor of the dyad, or these kind of
Mhm.
polarized aspects of the one, which is beyond subjectivity. But anyway, even without saying subjectivity itself is the ultimate thing, there has to be an ultimate thing that grounds all the differences. Langen's specific argument is, if there's anything that I can say anything about or interact with in any capacity, if it's real to me, therefore, it has to participate in the same kind of syntactic medium that I do. Or, I mean, in physical terms, obviously, anything that I can point to cohabits a space with me. That's the common medium. But more fundamentally than that, in the realm of pure information, concepts, mathematics, whatever is knowable, whatever's not knowable, but that we rub up against in any capacity, there has to be some medium bridging the gap between us and it. And if we both inhabit that medium, then all the higher properties that I contain they have to have their root or ground in that medium. And therefore, whatever can make itself felt in any capacity is rooted in the same kind of thing that I am. And so the move to, and I wouldn't use this language, but the move to say that everything is subjective, or a simple kind of idealist framing, it's sort of saying, like, well, we know perfectly, well, not perfectly well, but we kind of know what the nature of reality is within our own mind. And rather than saying mind is this important categorical distinction that we have to privilege and prioritize, call it what you want, but like, reality is in here. What my ideas, they are real. And the way that reality discloses itself is in the categories of our perception that Kant will talk about, or like different phenomenologists can break it down in different ways. But like, that felt reality of my inner experience, again, to use the subjective language, that seems that's better known to us than whatever a purely objective existent would be. And like Schopenhauer, I don't see how you can have an object without a subject. It doesn't. It's inconceivable. It's not something. Like, what's the being in itself of objects beyond us, if it's not that same being, it's being in itself that we have? Like, Schopenhauer takes Kant's philosophy. He says there shouldn't be things in themselves. Ultimately, there can just be a single kind of thing in itself, and it's a substrate of everything else. He'll call it will. But really, I mean, he's influenced by the Upanishads and Platonic philosophy, along with Kant. And I don't fundamentally object to that move, because, again, what is the alternative? Like, how can we treat the ontology of things outside of us, or with which we're interacting, if we don't share any kind of ground with them? So I basically present that alternative. Either we follow Chris Langen's syntophionic regress, or the Brahman regress, or whatever you want to call it, Brahman regress, or something else. And I don't know what that something else is exactly.
Well, I think you're kind of setting up a false alternative, if I understand what you're saying. What might be helpful is to talk about what Heidegger's critique of representationalism is. So we were talking earlier about representationalism, and that's relevant to what you're talking about because there's this issue that's coming up in what you're saying between this issue about how does subjectivity know what is not it, right? And I detect in what you're saying to an extent, sort of buying into this fundamental representationalist assumption that there's an in here, that there's an interior that stands opposed to an out there, and there's a problem about getting the two together. Now, what Heidegger wants to argue is that that's a pseudo problem. Heidegger, this is super important to understand about Heidegger. That Heidegger is a phenomenologist. So Heidegger is a student of Husserl. And the phenomenological method is one where you do not make metaphysical assumptions at all. You do not come up with metaphysical theories. Instead, what you do is you observe things as you experience them. How do they show up to me? Like I was saying earlier, I alluded to the Heideggerian view about historical change. So what is it that brings about these changes from one epoch of being to another? Well, naively, we'll say, oh, well, people changed their minds. New theories were developed. And Heidegger thinks it's much more mysterious than that, because if we actually look at our experience of change, especially very fundamental social change, we usually are baffled by what brought these things about. Historians will debate what brought these changes about. And we, as experiencers, if I can use that term, we just see these things happening around us, right? We know we're not in control of them. Now, what that is a phenomenological description. It's trying to be true to what my experience actually is, rather than telling some phony story like, well, it was philosophers who made a decision to change how we look at things, and we got influenced by them, right? Well, similarly, Heidegger approaches the representationalist issue by saying, look, let's describe phenomenologically how we experience ourselves and how we experience the world. And if we do that, then we realize the fundamental falseness of trying to interpret our experience as being an attempt by something in an interior to contact by some means of representation, quote unquote, external things. The idea that I am contained in an interior and I have to somehow achieve contact with what's outside me is a theory. It's a metaphysical theory that doesn't at all describe our own actual experience. So when I'm sitting in this room talking to you, how do I experience what's around me and myself? I am not in an inside or in an interior called subjectivity. I'm out here with the things. I'm out here with the things themselves. I'm experiencing a world, in fact, directly. And if some representationalist wants to say, oh, no, you're experiencing it indirectly, you just don't realize it, well, that's just a theory that's not underwritten by our actual experience.
Well, the idea that we are directly accessing it is also a theory, right?
Well, no, that we're directly accessing it is what we experience. That's not a theory. That's the actual experience that we're having. So right now, I am experiencing. I'm holding this bottle of water in my left hand. I am experiencing this bottle of water directly. I'm using my
But
eyes. I'm using my tactile sense, but I'm in direct touch with this bottle. That's my experience. So when I say I'm experiencing the world directly, that's me describing basic experience. When a representationalist says, well, no, actually what you're doing is you're not experiencing that directly, that's adding in this theory that is highly problematic for reasons beyond even what Heidegger says, that explains what's going on in the background of experience. But as a phenomenologist, Heidegger is concerned only with how the world appears, how we how we experience that world around us. Now, what I'm leading up to saying, I know you want to say something, but let me just finish this point. What I'm leading up to saying is I want to address the point that you made about doesn't there have to be some kind of commonality between subjectivity and the world in order for the world to be knowable by subjectivity? And
Or to
Heidegger,
affect it in any way.
yes, and Heidegger would absolutely agree with you that that is necessary, and I would agree with you that that is necessary. Um, but to even speak about there needing to be something in common between subjectivity and the objective world is to dichotomize these things in a way that Heidegger finds unacceptable. Yes, I do have an interior where I think thoughts, but throughout my entire life, I am directly in touch with the things around me. There is not is not an indirect experience.
Well,
It's a
what do you
direct.
mean by the things around me? Because that, to me,
Well,
is through a lens of interpretation where these are things, they are in fact around me. There's a lot of concepts that are involved when you say that.
well, absolutely. I mean, the bottle that I have in my hand, I know what to do with it. I know what to call it. I know what its function is. Now, some primitive tribesman from some lost tribe in the Amazon might see this bottle of water and have no idea what it is or what its function is, right? So they would not interpret it, to use the word that you just used, they would not interpret it in the same way that I would. And that too is a matter of phenomenological description. How does this object show up to me? Well, in general, what Heidegger would say, and this actually relates ultimately to what he has to say about what being in fact is, what Heidegger would say is that things show up to me as having certain natures by virtue of, as you were just alluding to, the interpretive scheme that I'm operating with.
Hmm.
So, a primitive Amazonian tribesman would see this object. I mean, the object would still be physically present to the tribesman, but it would be interpreted differently, right?
Hmm.
So there is a world. So, what I mean by the things is the world that is present to us that we interpret in different ways. And you can give very, very simple examples of this. Like, suppose I'm walking through farmland and I don't see a single person. And then I walk a little further and I see, oh, there's a man up ahead standing in a field. And I come closer to this individual and I realize actually that's a scarecrow. Now, in both instances, when I was further away and when I'm closer, there's still this object, this thing that's showing up to me. But I go from one interpretation to another based on the information that I have. In other words, based on how close I actually get to the thing, right? So
Yeah.
we are so my the larger point I'm trying to make is yes, there has to be a connection between subjectivity and the world in order for the world to be knowable. But we don't need to make a connection, it's already connected. See, one of the problems with modern philosophy is that it first disconnects subjectivity from the world and then insists that we have to find some way to reconnect them. So,
Well, I think the disconnect is between animate and inanimate substances in classical terms. We know what it's like to be ensouled, again, in the classical sense, and to experience our own thought process and to experience things like recognition of an object gradually or being mistaken about the object. Like that's what we know, and then we extrapolate to the nature of whatever physis is in itself from there, and we're going to have to apply analogies from our own experience as ensouled beings to account for the nature of inanimate matter, or for Aristotle in the classical world, matter wasn't so much inanimate as moved rather than unmoved, uh, or rather self-motive, automotive. So, I mean, I guess I'm still having a hard time understanding the nature of the criticism. Let's talk about it in biological and physical terms a little bit. So it seems clear to me that the things around me I experience insofar as I interact with some facet of them via reflected light or transfer of force potentials when I pick it up, and those are filtered, the raw sense data, the way the physical effects of that object or signs of that object, signals reporting the existence of the object reach me. It's filtered through my kind of gross body, you might say, into nervous signals, which are again a layer of kind of code that encodes for a reality that is larger and more complex. And that leaves open the possibility, like with a Copenhagen interpretation, where some of that, what is not specifically contained in the code that we receive, is actually ontologically ambiguous rather than fixed. So we can leave that question open. Is it a fixed reality or not? What we do see is a gradual reduction from a more complex physical reality, whether it's fully deterministic or it itself is indeterministic and is composed of mystery or not. Then we get to how we interact with it physically. And then from what physically interacts with us, we get to what we encode neurologically. And then when it reaches our mind, those signals that we get, the invariant
But
representations in
why is
cosmic
it?
psi
But I'm not.
terms.
I'm losing the thread of this. Why is it? Why is it important to bring up all of this biology? Why? How does that? How does
Because,
that shed? How does that shed light on the issues?
well, this is like my phenomenological account. Yes, I see when I grab things like bottles and so forth, but bottles can, so when he talks about like the readiness to hand of the hammer rather than like it standing there totally outside of us, I think what he's really getting at is that there's a field of potential functions that we can derive from the object of perception. We can use it as a hammer, sure, but the scientist may see, well, I can also break down these molecules and chemically analyze the substance and then harvest these chemicals and reconstitute a totally new object. And so like the applying that to our own person, I think is implicitly there as a potential response to our engagement with the physical world. And that's what a lot of science is kind of
Well,
about, re-engineering the way that we
what?
interface with objects.
But what's there as a potential reaction to the world? I don't remember your exact words, but so what
So,
you so there's a
mhm,
distinction between a physiological or biological account of perception and consciousness and a phenomenological account. So it is true that, of course, when we talk about our consciousness, when we talk about subjectivity, we can talk about things like how the eyes work and how the brain
mhm,
works, right? But
mhm.
that's a totally different level of analysis from what's a phenomenological description.
I
A
don't think
phenom-
so.
no, a phenomenological description. But look, you're
It's
not
not totally
excluding.
separate.
But well, but right now, when you're looking at the screen, there's all sorts of stuff going on with your eyes and the synapses of your brain, none of which you are actually experiencing. Phenomenology describes what you are actually experiencing, not what lies behind the experience and could possibly explain the experience. It is just on the level of how is the world showing up to me right now, including myself.
I think this is a time issue. It's not actually a difference in kind. It is, I when I first see something, it appears to me filtered through the, I'm just going to again use the theoretical evolutionary biology account according to my instincts, inbuilt patterns of thought as a creature in the world, my kind of naive evolved sense of the world, umwelt, whatever. It appears to me there first. That's when that, and like in terms of human development, first we encounter a rock as what we can do with that rock with our hands. But as we develop our toolkit, the way that we can interface with objects, and therefore the way they phenomenologically disclose themselves to us, expands greatly. And so when we use scientific instruments to break down the substances and get the chemical analyses and reconstitute them, like all of that, it's no different really than the readiness to hand of the hammer. It is simply a matter of how far removed is it, how many steps of operations intervene between my naive initial perception and then all of this analysis and breaking down and theorizing about the object. And because also like affording the possibility of theory building is one of those uh readinesses that are built into objects of perception. So I don't think there's a hard break between the phenomenological mode and the scientific mode. Basically, I think that like the phenomenological reduction that Husserl attempts is like, I'm going to go back to thinking like a caveman for a minute. But if you just kept going in the phenomenological reduction mode, eventually you'd have to do the phenomenology of science, which of course is a thing in philosophy. I'm sure you're not thinking of that. But like, I don't see it as a hard break. It seems like a continuum to me. And it's really a matter of how many steps of removal am I from engaging with what appears to me in terms of, you know, synapse firing and like fine grained physical details.
I think that there is a hard break, and there is a complete difference between the phenomenological perspective and the scientific perspective. So, and I think we've kind of gotten off track here. But let me say this, and then I want to talk about something that relates to the larger point that we were trying to get at when we got into all this discussion about perception and phenomenology. But just to take an example, I'm looking across the room at an object that's red. I have a coat across the room that has a red lining. Okay, so right now I'm experiencing the color red. Now, what I could do if I'm a scientist is go into a completely different mode in which what I try and do is to analyze how is it possible for me to experience this color? And then I'm going to dissect eyes, and I'm going to study the perceptual apparatus that we have. I'm going to go into cognitive science and biology and study this, right? But that's a totally different focus. That's from simply being aware of the experience of red or the experience of this coat. So you
Hmm.
referred earlier to saying that Husserl wants us to sort of momentarily go back to the standpoint of a caveman. No, he's talking about the standpoint of all human beings. As I go throughout the day, and this is true also of cognitive scientists who have studied how the senses and how the brain works. As I go throughout the day, I experience objects directly, and I don't experience any of that apparatus that is in my body that enables me to experience red or enables me to experience anything else. Now, but the point that I was trying to make by bringing up phenomenology is is that Heidegger is arguing that we don't need to make a connection between the subjective and the objective. The modern philosophy is full of pseudo problems, like the problem of other minds and the problem of the external world. The problem of the external world is a problem because we've in advance dichotomized consciousness from the world. And so we then have to figure out a way to get them together. If you start off by thinking, I exist in a kind of subjective interior, then the external world becomes a problem. Then you start talking about something called the external world. But in fact, for Heidegger, these things are already together. I am actually in the external world. There is no such thing as an external world. I'm in the world. And that's the connection. You were saying earlier, doesn't there have to be some kind of connection between subjectivity and the world? Well, we're already connected. But there's a huge difference between saying that subjectivity is a part of the world and the subjective and the objective are indeed connected, and wanting to reduce the objective to the subjective. So, and that's what Heidegger sees
Hmm.
as sort of the hidden telos through the history of philosophy. In this regard, let me mention a philosopher that we've not talked about so far that is a philosopher that I have been interested in since I was an undergraduate. I've been simultaneously fascinated and repulsed by him, and that is J.G. Fichte, who
Hmm.
was really Kant's first major follower and believed himself to be a Kantian and that he was perfecting Kant's philosophy. Kant himself wouldn't have any of that and repudiated what Fichte came up with. Fichte was then subsequently a huge influence on Schelling and Hegel. And he's a philosopher that absolutely perfectly illustrates the kind of primacy of subjectivity or anthropomorphism that Heidegger sees in the tradition that he's critiquing. Okay, so what Fichte's philosophy is often misrepresented, but I'll give it to you in a nutshell. In a nutshell, what Fichte believes. Well, okay, let me start a different way. People think that what Fichte's philosophy is about, and you'll find this if you go and you read histories of philosophy like Copleston or whoever. People think that what Fichte's philosophy is about is how the world around us is a projection of the ego. The idea is that the ego or the absolute ego projects a world around us of which we are conscious. And that is actually a misreading. It's been persuasively argued in recent years by scholars that that's a misreading of Fichte, and that his actual position is not that the world around us is a projection of the ego, but that it should be. So he doesn't hold that the world is a creation of the ego, but he holds that it should be a creation of the ego. Fichte's aim, and Fichte was very much a part of the Enlightenment. He was an enthusiast for the French Revolution. Fichte's aim is he believes that the human vocation is to remake the world according to human desires and human ideals, so that the ultimate end of this, the telos of this, which he believes is never going to be reached absolutely, is the erasure of the distinction between the subject and the object. If we could actually achieve what Fichte's ideal is, and again, like I said, he doesn't think we can get wholly there, but we can work toward it. But if we could actually achieve this objective of, of the human mind remaking the world according to its own aspirations, its own desires, and its own ideals, then the world we would be confronted with would, in effect, be a product of our minds. It would be
Hmm.
nature transformed, not what is, but what we think ought to be. You see,
VR is the telos of being, right?
what
Um,
is the telos of being?
VR, virtual reality.
Oh, okay. So I bring Fichte up because he is a good paradigm example of this tendency in philosophy that Heidegger is critiquing. And just to jump a few steps ahead, what
Wait, can
Heidegger
we jump a step back before we jump ahead?
okay,
Um,
okay.
Yeah, because I'm still not convinced that there's a hard break between a phenomenological mode and other modes. Because I kind of buy the Duhem Quine thesis. I don't think there are brute facts. I think that everything that we perceive is automatically interpreted through our theoretical priors. Because what is afforded isn't just an outline, isn't just shape and color and so forth. What it is to us is what it can be as well, and all of those possibilities inherent in an object are theoretically offered. They're not offered. I mean, I guess there are some things like the gravitational potential and our intuitions of the hardness of the object and so forth. But you know, beyond certain very primitive caveman-like scenarios, the way we perceive things is it the potential of those objects is baked into perception, and we know those potentials through our theoretical priors. So perception is given already theoretically interpreted.
Well, I mean, that's true. I mean, one of the ways in which things show up to us is in terms of their possibilities, what we could do with them, for example. So it is possible to look at a tree and see it as potential pencils or potential paper, right? Part of the being of the tree is how we relate to it. And we can relate to it in multiple ways. right? It can be something we lean against when we've decided to go and sit in the park and read. It can be something that shelters us, or it could be something that we want to chop down and use as a Christmas tree or make into paper or whatever. That's all entirely correct. The problem is when you see nature, when you see the object as nothing but something that exists for human transformation. And that was the point of my getting into Fichte, because that's basically Fichte's position. And it is a paradigm example of the modern standpoint, because Fichte literally believed that a world around us exists so that we can transform it and perfect it. And
Hmm.
Schelling started off as a follower of Fichte, and then they had a major break because Schelling wanted to create a philosophy of nature in addition to Fichte's transcendental idealism. And the philosophy of nature was motivated by Schelling's recognition that nature is valuable beyond just its utility. For Fichte, nature is valuable only in terms of its utility, only in terms of what we can make of it. And for Schelling, nature had value beyond that. And Fichte would not admit that, and so basically ceased to have any relations with Schelling. But if you take that Fichtean standpoint, where nature is regarded just as raw material for human exploitation, what Heidegger argues is that's the standpoint that we're all living in today. That is the standpoint of modern technological civilization. And he has a word for this, das Gestell. Gestell in German is actually an ordinary word. It can mean like a rack or a frame. But what Heidegger argues that is that we moderns in modern technological civilizations see everything in a kind of frame or a kind of framework that we place around it. Things have no intrinsic being of their own. There's only what we can make them into. And I would submit that this is a correct identification of what the current standpoint is in modernity, is that we really do regard the world, the nature around us, and other human beings as being material for exploitation and manipulation. And the sort of, if we step back a bit and get a bird's eye perspective of this whole discussion, which has principally been about Heidegger, what Heidegger is arguing is that the origins of that modern perspective, where we've reduced being simply to what we can exploit or what we can use, that has its origins in the metaphysical tradition, and in this will, if you will, to reduce the subjective to the objective. Excuse me, sorry, it's the opposite. To reduce the objective to the subjective, so that what is truly real is subjectivity, and the objective, insofar as it exists, must be brought into accord with the agenda of subjectivity. That's exactly Fichte's own position. And I think that, and Heidegger thinks that, we're living through that in the world today.
Mm. Well, what about a position that tries to, uh, in a utilitarian way, maximize for the good of all subjects? Would that still be this same kind of standing reserve mentality on the world, still subordinating to subjectivity? Because things that don't have subjectivity, that are truly inanimate objects, like a rock, I can see that they have value for subjects, but do they have value for themselves? I'm pretty agnostic on that and leaning towards maybe not.
So, the first part of what you said about the utilitarian position, can you articulate that again?
Well, I can see that it's a common sense, intuitive moral problem if
Right.
you view the world as something to be manipulated by your ego. But for it to be manipulated for the sake of subjects, of moral subjects, that doesn't seem immediately problematic because any consequence of destroying the environment, not valuing nature, is going to be uh, seen as bad because it negatively affects moral subjects. Like destroying a rock that doesn't have subjectivity and no one's going to notice that it was destroyed, it makes no difference to any moral decision making or perceiving creature. Why would that matter? Why is that a moral issue that I, grind up a rock?
It's not necessarily a moral issue. And certainly, yes, part of what we do as human beings is to take the world around us and transform it to meet human needs. And those could be my
Mhm.
individual needs or the needs of my people, my culture. We are, in fact, the thing that probably characterizes us principally is we are the beings that do transform nature. And other animals do that up to a point, right? Birds build nests and beavers build dams, but we do it in a very thoroughgoing way, where we've even been able to penetrate into, the ultimate structure of natural objects and manipulate them in various ways.
Mhm.
So there's nothing wrong with that. Heidegger doesn't think that there's anything wrong with that. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. Where I see the problem coming in is when we regard nature or the world around us, which includes human beings, as being nothing but material for exploitation. If we take this position, for one thing, quite obviously, the result of this is dehumanization. So one very good historical reflection of this standpoint would be communism. So what is communism except the position that human beings can be remade, that human beings are raw material to be perfected, to be changed, to be transformed, right? And we saw the disaster that led to. In our own society, in capitalist civilization, people are in a dehumanized state because they live only for things, for commodities, which have been transformed from nature by the system. And they
Mhm.
themselves have been transformed in order to simply to want these things and nothing else. So actively in our own system, we operate under the assumption that human nature is infinitely malleable and people can be transformed and remade into the kind of human subjects that we want them to be.
I don't see
And
that as a product of the metaphysical tradition, though. I mean, slavery existed long before the axial age.
but slavery is not an example of what I'm talking about. Slavery is just you take somebody and you say, go over there and chop this wood. What I'm talking about is the idea that we can fundamentally transform human nature. So the assumption of modernity, and you see this in the Enlightenment, you see this in the far left, you see this on the right, you see this in classical liberalism, is the idea that we can make a fundamental change in human nature, that we can, well, for example, enlighten all human beings and fundamentally change the nature of human beings and the nature of society, that everything is infinitely malleable. Everything, in other words, can be brought into accord with human desires and human ideals. So you said, how does this have to do with the metaphysical tradition? We'll go back to the beginning and what Heidegger is saying inaugurated the entire thing, which is the idea that what is what can be accommodated to human desires and human beliefs and human ideals. So you start off with an assumption like that. What you end with is modern technological civilization. You end with a civilization where everything has become uniform and replicable and replaceable. It's all the eternal recurrence of the same, including human beings. Everything is being manipulated and transformed. Now, one of the differences I have with Heidegger is that he seemed to think that you could keep this going indefinitely. Because again, Heidegger doesn't have a theory about where the epochs of being come from. And he's also highly skeptical, and this is what makes him a conservative. He's highly skeptical about our ability to manipulate those historical epochs and make changes in how we regard being, in fundamental ways in how we're thinking. So the 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 coming into being of the era that we're living in now, which you referred to it as the era of standing reserve or the era of Das Gestell. This is something that we don't know how it arose. We don't know exactly where it came from. We don't know where it's going. There's a famous interview with Heidegger that was published in the German magazine Der Spiegel. That's called, the title of the interview is "Only a God Can Save Us Now." Because whenever anybody hears what Heidegger thinks, especially about this predicament that we're in modern civilization, they always wanted to ask, what's the answer? What do we do? And Heidegger's answer is he doesn't know what we can do. He believed it was possible that the sort of civilization dominated by Das Gestell that we're experiencing now could continue to exist indefinitely. Where I disagree with him is that seems to assume that nature and human nature really are infinitely malleable. But I don't think that they are. I think there are limits to their malleability, limits to the degree to which human beings and the nature of human societies can be changed. And I think we're experiencing that now. So we went through the disaster that was communism and the attempt to build the workers' paradise, which claimed the lives of around 100 million people in the last century. Now we're living through arguably a worse catastrophe, the catastrophe of multiculturalism. But it's not working smoothly. What we're discovering is that it's not working. People are rebelling against it. The structures of society seem to be very precarious in multicultural societies. I think there is a limit to how much we can transform nature and human nature, and that there has to come an end to this position or to this cultural phenomenon. But what's interesting to me as a philosopher, going back to what we were saying at the beginning about what is the point of philosophy, what's interesting to me as a philosopher is to understand how we got here. How did we arrive at this situation where we really do believe, that we can infinitely change and perfect human societies and human beings? How did we get to the position where we think that you could have a functioning society that's just a hodgepodge of people of different cultures that happen, in fact, to conflict with each other in fundamental ways? How did we get to the point where we were so naive and really idealistic in the bad kind of idealism? Well, I think that the attraction of Heidegger is that he presents us with an account of how we got to this point that looks to the metaphysical tradition, that looks to how thinkers have understood being. And as I said earlier, he doesn't think philosophers are driving the world, but he does, of course, think that they have an influence. And he's telling a story about there being a kind of anthropomorphism in human nature, this will to collapse the distinction between the subjective and the objective. And he's arguing that plays itself out in the Western metaphysical tradition, and it issues in the sort of world that we're living in today in the West. And I think these are very challenging ideas that, if they're right, do to a great extent explain the sort of predicament that we're in. Ultimately, the predicament that we're in is due to an overestimation of the power of human reason to change reality, and also a kind of anthropomorphism where we want to make subjectivity central to what is real and the ultimate arbiter of what is real.
Yeah. So, I mean, I hear that historical narrative, and I don't know how to distinguish it from a Just So story. I think obviously the
And
metaphysical
what
tradition
is
has
it just what
contributed
is
to
it?
what, well, the idea that because like the essential causal explanation is that we collapsed objectivity into subjectivity there, and then a bunch of steps, therefore the modern world with standing reserve, etc. And I think like each of those steps are tenuous and sort of verbally tilted and not very rigorous. That's just hearing it from what I've heard in general of the perspective. So I'm just not sold on like this is the driving factor behind everything. Obviously, it's a factor. Everything that happened in the past is a factor in what's happening now. And I would also say that the metaphysical perspective, it's like it's the seed of the scientific worldview in all its positive senses and also the negative ones. Like any tool has potential for good or ill. It's not like the possession of a hammer necessitates that I hammer nails into wood. I could also take it and bash someone's skull in, but I'm not going to. And so, like, to blame the hammer in that sense, to blame metaphysics and say that it, dialectically in a pseudo Hegelian way just panned out or rolled out into what we have now and all the attitudes we have now, I don't think it has to go that way. I think there are other factors that lead us to have a disregard for the natural world. And actually, in another way, like our metaphysical civilization in the West have been a lot more conscientious of nature and the value of otherness and subjectivity, and we care more about animal rights than the less metaphysical Chinese. I consider the Chinese a relatively materialistic people compared to us, um, or not like reflectively spiritual or metaphysical in the way that we have been. So I kind of see evidence in both directions that it's made us more concerned about otherness and also open even to mystery and the mystery of the individual soul and their capacity for freedom. And on the one hand, we think we can engineer society from the top down. On the other, we want to hear from individuals in a way that other non-metaphysical societies have not, because we haven't had this regard for their sacred status. And kind of uniquely in the West, where this has been a philosophical and more creative enterprise than in the East. In India, they believe that the Atman at the core of everyone is this same Brahman, and yet they treat some people as pure objects. I don't think that's like determined by their metaphysics either. I think that metaphysics opens up for greater compassion or greater cruelty or
Well,
disregard, depending.
but, but there's a misunderstanding of what you're saying. Heidegger is not saying that the modern world has been caused by metaphysics. That's not his position. His position is that there is a certain way of thinking that arises at a certain point in Western history and that takes over the way that human beings are regarding themselves and the world. And for lack of a better term, it is a kind of an anthropomorphism. If you look at Greek thinking prior to the metaphysical tradition, it is trying to place human beings within the world. Look at the mythological tradition. It's trying to place human beings within the world, but without arguing that that world is here for us or that we can somehow reduce the world to subjectivity or human desires. So what Heidegger believes is that there's a certain anthropocentric way of thinking that arises at a certain point in Western history and that animates the Western intellectual tradition and then issues in the sort of civilizational spirit that we have in modernity, in modern technological civilization. And again, he's trying to be a good phenomenologist when it comes to history and historical change. We don't know where this came from. We don't know why it exists, but it's there. And it's easy to try and summarize Heidegger, but as I said before, the proof is in the pudding. The proof is in working through how he treats these different thinkers and seeing this common element. But again, he's not holding that it's philosophers that move the world. Philosophers are giving expression
To
to
a
the
shift in
spirit of
attitude.
to the no well yes to the spirit of the times. So there is this very mysterious way in which there's something at work in human nature that begins with the ancient Greeks and in the West, that begins with the ancient Greeks and issues in the present day, which is a kind of willful denial of whatever resists the grasp of subjectivity. And as to
Hmm.
where this comes from, again, it's not metaphysics doing this. Metaphysics is the result of this.
Yeah, I get that, but the causal explanation is the same thing that triggers the metaphysical tradition is that thing that leads to the current state of our society and standing
Right.
reserve and all these things that he does problematize and morally impugn. And I would say I'm not convinced of that. It's like it's not a real falsifiable hypothesis. Not that I'm like all for falsifiability, but it's like it's just kind of a lot of language and a narrative that I can take that as a partial explanation, but I'm just not so sold on it that that's going to be my framework. Like I'm just as open to a kind of Spanklerian reading and what's happening in civilizational cycles. I think that the metaphysical attitude too, because we don't have real good information on what that attitude was prior to the axial age because of the paucity of the literary evidence. I'm just much more hesitant. I'm also very hesitant to view the phenomenological reduction as a real categorical break, and I am more inclined to think that we look at things filtered through our theoretical lens. And when someone says, "I'm not theorizing, I'm simply describing," I'm just very skeptical. I don't think that we experience the world directly, like that is known anymore, or a theoretically, than the statement that we know the world through our representations. So all of it, I'm sort of, I hear it. I'm not sold. I don't believe in a lot of this in the way that I would believe in a scientific theory. And I guess like my response to the modern world would be to lean into the metaphysical tradition and I wanted to raise this. I know you have to leave pretty soon here, or maybe like immediately, but I wanted to raise this point. Like my problem with skepticism, which leaving open mystery is sort of the Pyrrhonist attitude, but the problem with that is you don't know what you can and can't know a priori. So we don't know what's intrinsically mystery and what we can actually find out. And so, because of that, like, well, let's work with what we can work with. We can't work with what is intrinsically unknowable. We also don't know where that line is. Like, we can postulate what is knowable and what's unknowable, like the later Platonists did. You know, they have their ontological hierarchy and they say we can reach up to here. Beyond there, we can't reach, at least not as humans. But then what if we can transcend the human condition not through transhumanism, or maybe that can happen? I'm agnostic as to what happens when you start messing with human nature, how far that may go. And my guess at what happens in the future is going to be informed by theory and like Platonic theories of archetypes and what happens when you deviate from an archetype, and whether like a mechanistic bottom up picture can like construct the world. I also disagree with that, but not on Heideggerian grounds, it seems, more on Platonic grounds, that there are certain structuring principles of nature. And if you deviate sufficiently from that, what you build will not be stable. Because there are real structuring principles, archetypes that are knowable. And so, but then maybe we can transcend the human condition by, some kind of Benham psychosis, process. Maybe we can go beyond and transcend humanity, at least subjectively, as souls going beyond. But all of that, I would point to, I have to build the most comprehensive worldview and theory incorporating modern science. So I'm just not very in favor of like rejecting the metaphysical tradition on the grounds that it's causing problems, which maybe that's not what Heidegger's doing exactly. And I know it's not the
Well, no,
metaphysics, it's the attitude. But
it's not what he's doing. I mean, Heidegger is a great student of the metaphysical tradition, and certainly anybody who reads Heidegger, uh, and it's not enough just to get a summary of what's going on, because as I said before, the proof is in the pudding. One has to actually work through these texts and see what Heidegger actually says. But Heidegger, is a great student who, one of the things that comes out is the reverence that he has for the philosophical tradition. This is not a case of a philosopher coming up with reasons to dismiss the metaphysical tradition, or
I read
metaphysician.
the beginning of Being in Time, and he does seem to dismiss an awful lot.
Well, you need to read more because there's a lot more, and the Heidegger after Being in Time is quite different from the Heidegger of Being in Time. There is this phenomenon in Heidegger's intellectual history called the turning, where his approach to philosophy changes rather radically after Being in Time. But certainly in his lecture courses dealing with different figures in the history of metaphysics, there is this great respect and great reverence that comes through. So, I mean, this is not somebody who is looking for an excuse to dismiss the metaphysical tradition.
Hmm.
Heidegger is a conservative thinker. You know, notoriously he was a member of the Nazi Party, and an enthusiastic Nazi for a grand total of about 12 months. But he's definitely a very much a conservative figure. And, you know, if you ask what that means, I think what's central to it is the recognition on his part, and I think this is true of conservatism generally, of genuine conservatism, the recognition that human reason is limited in its ability to understand the world, and that there is a dimension of mystery that we tend to have a pattern of wanting to dismiss or to deny. So, you know,
Hmm.
what's crucially important in understanding Heidegger is to understand what it means to be a phenomenologist. And Heidegger is giving a phenomenological reading of history or of our response to history. And he says that basically we can make up whatever theories we want to about what moves history, you know, like the theory that philosophers move history. And I've known people who actually took that position. But ultimately, historical change is mysterious.
Hmm.
Heidegger is very much an anti-modern thinker, which I think is one of the reasons why he's so important for conservatives. He's very much an anti-modern thinker, and he he takes the position that the ultimate refutation of modernity is that it cannot explain itself. We don't know exactly why we're in the situation that we're in. Now, he argues that it has its origins in this shift in human sensibilities in the West away from a pre metaphysical recognition of absence and mystery, which again you can find evidence of in the mythological tradition, and toward this idea that what truly is what we can perceive, what we can know, and what we can somehow control.
Hmm.
But why that shift took place is very mysterious, and he offers no
Yeah.
answer to this.
The
So
shift,
ultimately,
the purported
yeah,
shift, sorry, it seems a little strawmanish to me. It's like the characterization of Plato. When I read Plato, that's not the impression that I get. And the idea that we can influence the world, you don't have to go to the extreme that it is simply standing reserved for the application of human will. I think very few people believe that. And I don't buy that this is like some underlying telos of this attitude in the West that developed. I think it's an aberration away from a healthy mentality. I also think, philosophers do lead to progress insofar as they give rise to sciences. I think technological conditions, not in a totally
well,
Marxist
well,
dialectical sense, but they,
hold on, because you said something important
sure.
that I want to respond to. Yeah, it is an aberration, but you have to look at not what people say that they think, or the ways in which they say that they perceive things, but how our society actually behaves. And if you look at the way we behave, it is as if we have the conviction that basically everything that exists is raw material for our exploitation.
I don't think that's an attitude thing. I think that's just an available technology thing. I think humans have an appetitive nature by nature. And when we have more power, we want to do more with that power. And we live with more technological capacities today. And that's brought on by science, which is brought on by philosophy. I look at like Pythagoras. He's kind of an archetypal philosopher, the great philosopher to me. He established these communities and really had this whole worldview that they put into practice in research institutions. They developed half of the math in Euclid and then set the Greeks way farther ahead than anyone else in real technical knowledge of the nature of the world. And like that occasionally does happen. And when I look at what do I want to do with philosophy, I want to do what Pythagoras did, because knowing scientifically the nature of what is possible and what's not possible will allow us to make informed moral decisions. And the like accepting the mystery, like, okay, I acknowledge there is mystery, but I don't presume to know where the line between what is possible to know and what's not possible lies. And all I can do, therefore, is work within the realm of the known, building theories that allow me to not just have more raw power, but also know what is right and what is wrong to do with that power. Um, so I
So
don't see
I
how that
would,
gels with Heidegger's attitude.
so I would say, and maybe on this note we should conclude,
Yeah,
but
we
I would
better.
say, that the tendency that we're talking about, um, this idea that there is mystery, it is true that we can remove mystery. And certain things that are mysterious, we can overcome mystery and achieve knowledge. Now, the pre-metaphysical Greeks, from this Heideggerian perspective, didn't deny that. But what they did maintain was that there would always be an element of mystery in human experience or in the world that could not be overcome. And I said a moment ago, it's not like everybody in the modern world is thinking consciously that everything that exists is raw material for exploitation. But if you look at how we behave as a culture, that does seem to be our operating assumption.
You think more than the
And well,
East?
hold on. And similarly, we're scientists aren't running around saying there is no mystery. All mysteries can be overcome. There's no such thing as an intrinsic mystery. They're not saying this, but that's in effect how scientists behave, and certainly how their advocates behave. There is a distinction, of course, that you have to make between science and scientism, but certainly the spirit of the sciences, spirit of the modern sciences, is that in principle, all mystery can be overcome. And there is also a tendency to think, and you see this over and over and over again, there's a tendency to think that if something cannot be explained by current scientific theories, then it doesn't exist or it's not important. So, and that is, again, this is an expression of that tendency that Heidegger is referring to in effect reduce the objective to the subjective, or to declare the subjective as absolute. If this phenomenon I am looking at doesn't fit with my own ideas, or the ideas that we have as a culture have established, it doesn't exist. I mean, obvious examples of this would be, treatments of all sorts of anomalies that scientists encounter and initially will deny, or the treatment of, unusual phenomena like so-called psychic phenomena. So the difference between the metaphysical and the pre-metaphysical is not that the pre-metaphysical standpoint says we can't solve any mysteries, or can't attain knowledge. It's a recognition that there is always this element that will go beyond what we're capable of knowing, and the affirmation of that, as opposed to the arrogance that has led to the situation that we're in now, where we believe that everything is malleable, everything is changeable, and we have wreaked havoc on nature and on human beings as a result of that assumption.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I would just leave us with the thought: is Western civilization uniquely guilty of this, or axial age cultures, are they uniquely guilty, or is it a human problem? Is it a product? I'm not convinced it's a product of this the attitude that led to the metaphysical tradition. I think it's probably more that we have the tools to abuse our power, and I think the solution is going to be more knowledge so that we know what to do in a better way rather than more ignorance or more mystery. I mean, I think it's
Well,
a
now
straw
hold
man to
on,
say that
hold
we
on.
shouldn't.
No,
Go ahead.
you're attacking a straw man. I've not advocated ignorance. I agree with you that we need knowledge. Primarily, what we need is self-knowledge. We need to know our own limits. What are the limits of what we can do with ourselves and with the world around us? So I agree with you. But
Yeah, we have to end.
it's been a good discussion.
Yeah, I'd like to talk again. I'm just it seems like Heidegger puts forward some theories, and I don't know how to evaluate them or whether they're the driving factor, or also what specifically to do with them. It's like Heidegger himself didn't know. So I'm just more drawn towards that Pythagorean. It's very prescriptive. It's very, we're going to build a program, we're going to build a society around it, and we're just going to do things for the betterment of mankind. I think he did. Heidegger, has he done things for the betterment of mankind yet? I'm not sure. I really cannot analyze that. And if we think that
What
yes,
would the betterment of mankind consist in fundamentally?
building better societies where more of us live healthy lives.
Well, certainly in that case, I think that Heidegger can have a very good influence because at the moment we're building societies that don't work, and the basis of those societies is overestimating the power of reason to create new sorts of cultures that have never existed on the face of the earth and the sort of human beings that have never existed. So I think Heidegger's perspective has the potential to be very beneficial to mankind.
Right. If that diagnosis is correct, and I'm just not sold on it yet, but we'll continue considering it. I hope we can speak again in the future. I'll let you go. I know you had something planned, but thanks everyone for tuning in. This has been a very interesting discussion. I'd like to get to the bottom of Heidegger one day. If that means reading 10,000 pages, then I don't know if I'll get there, but I will talk to Heideggerians as much as they'll let me. So, all right. Thanks for